Welcome to the Inside Housing Podcast, where we break down the housing process, real estate, and investing. Here we go. Kevin, glad you could make it. Appreciate it. I'm very excited for this one. So why don't you just introduce yourself for anybody who hasn't been following you, doesn't know a little bit about you. Just tell us who you are and what your project's about.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Kevin Chu. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Futures Project. A little bit about who I am. I grew up in Vermont. I'm the son of immigrant parents. My parents came to this beautiful state back in 1986 and ended up in Vermont of all places because I have an aunt that married an American, and they happened to have a home in Shelburne at the time. So my parents made this really brave decision in their mid-20s to leave behind everything and everyone they knew in pursuit of the American dream, in pursuit of economic opportunity. And I feel so lucky to say that they were able to find that here. They were able to make things work, raise a family, put 3 boys through college, buy a home. And my work with the Vermont Futures Project is inspired by them. I am the beneficiary of so many incredible opportunities, so much kindness in this community. I want to pay that forward. I want to make sure that Vermonters, whether they're here now or they come here in the future, they have access to opportunity. So that's what inspires me to do the work of the Futures Project, which I'll say a little bit more about the organization now.
So just break down to the timeline, because when I was looking at it, you started the project 2 years ago, or maybe 3 now. And what led you to that point?
I joined the organization in 2022, and the project had started back in 2015. It was an initiative through the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. The motivation for starting the Futures Project is that policy should be informed by data. Crazy idea.
I know, right? Crazy idea. Inform it by data?
Yeah.
Whoa. Okay.
Controversial. So in 2015, when it launched, the Futures Project worked to aggregate data from federal sources, state sources, even local data when it was available and reliable, and created a one-stop shop data dashboard that became a public resource. Through the pandemic, the organization really leaned into the education side of its mission with a campaign called the Vermont Economy Talks to demystify what we mean when we say the economy, right? Because if I walk around outside and just chat with Vermonters and I say that phrase, the economy, you'll get a lot of different reactions and feelings because it can feel like this nebulous thing that just happens to us. The Futures Project wanted to help people understand what is the economy, how do we interact with it, how do we shape it, and that set up the most recent phase of our work, which is forward-looking. What do we want to be when we grow up as a state? What does Vermont look like in 10, 15, 20 years? And that led to the Economic Action Plan.
So how many people around the state, especially in Chamber, were looking at it in that forward lens? Because as I was doing research, I didn't see a lot of data like you've compiled ahead of that. And a lot of times the conversations that I'm having is, we would like this better, we would like that better, very general, broad terms, but not like specific action plans. So you've gone ahead and you've put this together and you start compiling the data. And what were the things that just started to stand out right away?
Yeah, our plan is built on the pillars of people and places, but it was really inspired by my interaction with Vermonters. I had the privilege of traveling all around the state, spoke with over 5,000 people over the course of 2 years to build the plan, and I really wanted to understand what are the challenges that people are facing, what are the economic barriers, what are the frustrations that they have, but more importantly, what are their hopes, dreams, and ambitions for the future, for themselves, for their kids, for their community. So the recommendations are really geared towards helping to make that a reality, right? I think it can be difficult and scary sometimes working on a vision for the future, because it comes with a bit of uncertainty, and sometimes we might get things wrong. You know what? We have to be willing to take those risks and understand that we can course correct along the way. That's where data is really helpful too. Data is really important to help us understand how we got to where we are. We can track those trends, understand the decisions that have been made, but it doesn't dictate where we go. I say it all the time, data isn't destiny. If we do nothing, if we let the status quo hold, those trend lines are highly probable to continue to become destiny, but that doesn't have to be the case.
And one of the things that stands out about what the organization does is that it's nonpartisan. You're not affiliated with any political party. This is really just data driven to be able to inform those who would make the decisions about plans and strategies for growing and economic viability.
That's exactly right. And to your point that you made, we speak a lot in generalities. We want this better. We want that better. We're doing too much here. We're not doing enough there. A couple of phrases that I encountered all the time in my travels. We have a workforce shortage. We're in a housing crisis. How many times do you hear that?
I have a whole podcast about a housing crisis that we're in. And my lens as being a realtor and managing a real estate company is we see that shift in real time. And we see the demographic change. I see who's leaving. I'm having conversations with individuals on a literally daily basis, and they're saying, I would love to stay in Vermont, but I can't afford to stay in Vermont. Or I would love to downsize and I can't afford to downsize. Or my kids need a house, but I don't know if this is the place to stay. And so it more and more, I feel like there's almost this inflection point that's happening for the state. And your data is probably one of the sources that I go to the most to explain it to people. Because believe it or not, a lot of people don't know.
That's right.
And that's what surprises me the most.
Yeah, and just to finish that point, right? So when we hear those phrases, we have a workforce shortage, we're in a housing crisis. This is another place where data is super valuable and needs to be part of the conversation more often. If you hear someone say that, stop and ask, okay, how many workers do we need? How many homes do we need to alleviate the crisis? Because in the absence of that specificity, it's easy to get complacent. It's easy to see one development in your neighborhood and say, look, we're building housing. Why didn't the crisis go away? It's if at the beginning of the year I say, Rennick, I want to get more fit this year. And then I go and do one workout. I'm like, why didn't it work?
I asked myself all that time. I'm like, why didn't it work? I tried.
So you have to have specificity, have defined goals, track it with data so you understand where you are now, where you're trying to get to, and what are the incremental steps that you need to take to get there.
Okay. So let's dive into the data a little bit. So I have some numbers for you, which are all pulled from the research you've done. So right now, Vermont is sitting at about 644,000 people. The target that you'd set out for 2035 was 802,000. Our workforce participation rate is currently 61%. And we'd like to get to 70% participation rate. Our housing stock, we need about 24,000 to 36,000 by 2029. And then regulatory speed, so permitting, that's a huge issue. Ideally, a 40% reduction in some of those timelines. So with that data set, how did you get there? So how did we get from, we're at 644,000, we need 800,000?
Yeah, this goes back to what I was saying with the specificity. So when we take a look at the demographic shifts, there are labor force and economic implications for that. What I mean is Vermont's getting older. We're one of the oldest states by median age, and there are a lot of projected retirements in the coming decade. The Vermont Department of Labor projects about 17,150 retirements annually through 2032. Now, to contextualize that, there are 5,300 12th grade students in the entire state of Vermont.
It's very lopsided.
Very lopsided. Those numbers don't balance out. We don't retain 100% of our high school grads. That gap, that workforce shortage, will continue to grow unless we can add to the workforce supply through other avenues. Another component that adds to workforce supply is college graduate retention. We can do much better there. We're dead last in the country when it comes to college graduate retention.
So you're saying a lot of stuff. One, how did we get to be one of the oldest states? And then two, why are we so bad at retaining our college graduates?
Yep. I'll start with the first question. If you take a look at the growth trajectory of Vermont through the decades, we were on a pretty steady growth trajectory from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way up to about the year 2000. And then it started to plateau and flatline. The
This
past,
was around the 2000s.
but the slowdown happened even before the start of the new millennium. So the past 25 years of stagnation, that can be related back to housing. There's been a deceleration in the number of new housing projects being constructed decade after decade. Starting at about 1970, 1980, we started to see that trend slow down. So when it comes to population growth, a population can only grow to the extent that there's physical capacity in the built
Yes.
environment for that growth to happen. That's housing. So to bring it to a family scale, because I think sometimes it's easier to understand the big numbers when we break it down. Let's say you had a family of four, two adults, two kids, and that family purchased a home in Vermont 30 years ago. Four-bedroom home, and those kids lived a wonderful childhood, grew up here, fell in love with Vermont, and part of them really thought maybe I could stay here long term. Then they got to their mid 20s, and the community didn't build any new housing. So now their options are I could stay at home with mom and dad, try to compete to stay locally in the scarce housing market with high prices, or I need to leave. Right?
And so you're compounding that effect.
Yeah.
Like
And
everywhere.
now the two adults may be occupying a home with four bedrooms and they might not need all that and they're ready to downsize. But
Yes.
again, we didn't build enough new housing for them to have that option. So they're stuck. And not because they don't want to downsize, but because there's no choice for them unless they leave their community.
So with that, what, and if we're going back in time, what was the catalyst that triggered Vermont in particular to not be building any more houses? If we're going back 10, 15, 20 years, why? What changed that we stopped growing and building and constructing?
There was a large increase in Vermont's population in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a strong desire to move away from urban places, is back to the land movement that was happening nationally, and Vermont was the beneficiary of some of that growth. But it also came with some friction and pushback locally, where that rate of growth and the development that was happening was seen as a threat to Vermont's character, a threat to the physical landscape, the natural resources, the ecosystems. And Vermont responded by putting restrictions in place. Act 250 gets mentioned a lot in housing conversations. So there were policy decisions that were made to slow down some of that growth that was happening. That's one piece of it, right? That's state level policy. Layer on top of that local policy decisions. This is where we get into permitting and zoning and the accretionary effect, right? So adding those layers on top of each other compounds over time, and we've seen that rate of housing growth slow because of it.
So self-imposed, if I'm understanding correctly, that we as a state during that time period were trying to mitigate growth because it was a desire to keep a certain character and feel and people, and I understand that. I understand there is something special to lots of space, the trees, having a rustic feel to a state, and that attracted a lot of people. But at the same time, now we're not building new houses, we're not constructing, we're not adding to neighborhoods. And so, fast forward, now we have people who can't afford to be here and stay because of that. So, when you recognized through the data that this is an issue and we need to do something about it, how do we now start to transition to get there?
Yep. To me, it begins with a cultural shift and embracing a growth mindset. I believe that policies and programs are a reflection of the underlying attitudes and beliefs within a community. So, first, we need to have a strong understanding of the data And then we have to have that data start to shift people's thinking towards what are the benefits that can come with growth. Because, as I mentioned with Act 250 and the policy decisions intentionally made to slow that down, growth was seen as a threat. But now we've hit the brakes so hard that we've actually started to see decline
That's
in
right.
many areas. Sustainability isn't this static, fixed moment in time, but there are cycles of growth and decline, and we're in one of those decline periods, especially when we take a look at local level data. I did an analysis that's part of the Economic Action Plan, taking a look at town by town, what was the population peak historically, and what is the current population today. Many rural towns have experienced depopulation. If we were to just play out a thought experiment and say, what if we restored each of those towns back to their historical peak? How many people would that add to the state of Vermont? Just doing that adds over 70,000 people.
Just restoring them back to where we were.
Just rural revitalization. So if a town used to have 2,000 people and it's down to 1,000 now, we know at one point it held 1,000 more. What if we got back there? Because the infrastructure that's in place was probably built to accommodate 2,000 people. The roads, the buildings, wastewater systems, perhaps. So how do we tap into some of that latent capacity, that hidden potential that we've already invested in? Because the 1,000 people that are left are trying to sustain the infrastructure for 2,000, and that's really costly.
It is. So this January, the data showed that we actually lost about 1,800 individuals. Now, that's heading the wrong direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that kind of explains why there's this general feeling of, I don't want to say panic, but it's in everybody's conversation now, which is either we can't stay here, what's happening. I know the legislator is inundated with this is a real issue. So what are the things that we could do to start to course correct it? And I'm asking a lot of questions here, so we're going to parse them out. But housing is one of them, labor is another one, and then the ability to generate revenue. Take your pick.
I'll break it into some component parts, right? When we think about affordability, especially when we're thinking through the taxation component of affordability, there's tax base, right? How many taxpayers are there? There's tax rate. What is the rate of taxation on that base? And then there's the expenditures, the spending, right? Because based on what you want to spend and the tax base that you have, that's how the tax rate is determined. So the decisions in front of us as Vermonters are, which of those levers do we want to pull? Do we like the level of spending that we currently have? Or another way of asking that is, do we think that all of the services and the programs and the public infrastructure is crucial? And if so, then to sustain that, do we increase the tax rate or the tax base? And this is part of that scarcity versus abundance conversation. Mm-hmm. Scarcity route is maybe we need to cut back in some areas. We have enough people, we're spending too much, it's unaffordable, we need to lower that rate. So in order to lower the rate, we have to reduce the spending. That's one approach. The other one is, how about we grow that tax base so that each person pays a little bit less, but we can sustain all of the services and programs that we have.
So my question is this, is that makes sense to me, which is you have two options. And it's just like running a business. Yeah. I do it all the time. And I have two choices. Either to be profitable, I either reduce my expenditures, which grows my profit margin, or I increase my income, my revenue, which in this case is population. I feel like the conversation that I keep hearing is about reducing our expenditures over and over again. Currently, we have the education reform, which is going through, which is the conversation about that is how do we reduce spending on education, which I think should reduce itself. But that doesn't solve everything. So what conversations are you hearing, especially with the Chamber of Commerce, that is talking about how do we grow and attract people here? Because if we're going the other direction, and we know we need to increase it, why is that not getting equal amount of attention?
Yeah, great question. I'll drop a phrase in this podcast that I haven't used before, so this
Okay,
is
we're
fresh
ready.
content. If all we ever focus on is how to cut costs to manage the demographic direction that we're going, it's essentially economic hospice. It's how do we reduce the pain short term, but the long term outcome is predetermined if we're not going to grow. We have to grow to get out of this doom loop, this death spiral, right? Because time only works in one direction. And this is bringing it back to demographics. I mentioned the number of retirements that are projected annually. That translates into fewer services or higher costs for those services. That means businesses are closing. That means fewer economic opportunities for the next generation. There are plenty of examples around the country of states that have put in place economic strategies, intentional strategies to try to grow, to try to retain the talent they have, to incentivize business growth locally, to attract talent from elsewhere, to recruit businesses to relocate. And this is why we launched this January a competitiveness dashboard. It's a dashboard that ranks Vermont across a variety of metrics to show how are we doing relative to regional peers, relative to
Yeah.
national peers, because when we're making decisions about Vermont's economy, the economy doesn't end at the state border. We have to be competitive to make Vermont a great choice to raise a family, a great choice to grow a business. And if we're ranking quite poorly across a variety of metrics, well, maybe we should look to the states that are doing well and start to adapt and borrow some of those ideas because they're working elsewhere.
So as you're talking about that, some of the data that you have is we are 50th for residents 25 to 44 years old.
That's the tax base. That's the commercial health insurance payers as well.
We have the fourth highest state and local tax burden. We have the 33% education property tax increase, and it seems like it's just unsustainable. If the initiative is to grow, where do we start? Because it seems so big, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what I'm trying to wrap my head around is
Yeah.
that it seems so big, and we hear about it. We need more people, we need more housing, we want to attract people here, but where do you dial in and start to say we can actually start here to do something that would make a difference?
Yeah, I take a look at the business climate as one area where Vermont can make quick progress. That is one where policy decisions, tax structure is such a crucial lever for shifting not only mindset, but then where investments happen. This is where other states are outcompeting Vermont. But again, we can look to what's working elsewhere and start to adapt some of those strategies. We can also lean into some of the strengths, the competitive advantages that Vermont does have. I still remain hopeful and optimistic because there's still demand for Vermont. When we take a look at housing prices, for example, price is an indicator of the balance between supply and demand. I know I'm nerding out a bit with some
Oh,
economics
I like
definition,
it.
but the fact that prices have remained elevated is a market signal that people want to be here. People want to stay here. We can make some progress there by increasing the supply side, but the reason why I mention that is because if we put ourselves in the perspective of a business owner, for example, if there's demand for your product, there can be a bright future for your business. If there's no demand, if people didn't want to be here, that's a much more difficult future to build. That's a hard place to come back from. Whereas if there is demand, you figure out, okay, how do we scale up supply? How do we meet the market where it's at? And the fact that young people are coming to our colleges and universities, we have a really high net import export ratio, meaning that there are a lot of out of state students that see
That's right.
Vermont as a desirable place to get an education.
I think it's, what is it, almost 60% out of state in our colleges?
I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. It might be higher than that. Part of that is because we don't produce a lot of high school grads, but the fact that we can then, on top of the grads that we retain locally, the high school grads we retain locally, we can add so much more young talent from other states. That is a strength to build from. Not every state has that pipeline of potential talent. We've done the hard part of getting them interested and getting them to commit part of their life to come here and learn. We can finish building that pipeline by connecting those students to the community, to job opportunities, to mentorship, getting them embedded socially so that they see a viable future here. But they also need to have housing that fits with their needs. And this is where, again, I come back to demographics and housing as the root causes of so many of the symptoms, the challenges that we're facing. The needs of people in terms of what they're looking for in the housing market change throughout one's life. What I need for housing in my mid-20s is very different than what I need in my 30s or 40s. And then my needs might change again in my 60s, 70s, and 80s. And have we evolved our built environment to meet the needs of our population as it's changed? And the answer is no, we haven't.
So I see that quite a bit. When we have, for instance, I call it the ideal starter home, which is tends to be a 2 to 3 bedroom, 2 bath, maybe garage, maybe not, on a little bit of land. I'm not even talking a lot. Quarter acre, maybe half an acre, if they're ever reasonably priced. So I call it between 300 and let's say 500, depending on where you are in the state. Those houses are just, you can't keep them long enough because there is this pent up demand for that, for people
Mm-hmm.
trying to start in those kind of houses. So if that's identified as the need and what would be the catalyst in order to keep the talent here and have mobility and have people come into the state and want to stay and all that, what is preventing us from making more of those homes? And why is it that when we are building or new constructions, it seems to be the opposite? We're making condos, we're making high rises, we're making multi units. What's preventing us from doing that?
So I think that you're exactly right in terms of the pent up demand, right? Some of those homes, those starter homes, already exist. I hear the phrase missing middle a lot. And this is back to the demographic piece. Maybe they're not missing, they're just occupied by someone that might not need it anymore. But we have to have options for market mobility to unlock those homes that are already in our communities. I also think that with a problem as difficult as how do we build more housing, there's this tendency to try to pick one thing to blame, a single scapegoat. Oh, it's short-term rentals. Oh, it's land use regulation. Oh, it's developers. You name it. There's always some single explanation that someone's willing to give you. But when we take a step back and take a look at it in totality, this is what we do in the economic action plan. We try to break it apart into all the different pieces. So in terms of building houses, we use the 5 L's framework: land, labor, lumber, lending, and laws. So when we break out those components, then we ask, what does Vermont have control over? And what should we acknowledge but set aside? Federal interest rates. We don't set those here in Vermont. It's a challenge, certainly. It's a challenge everywhere across the country. Let's set that aside. Permitting, regulation. That we do have a bit of control over. So that's on the table now. Lending. Are there creative solutions there that can help even incrementally if it helps by 1 or 2% in the total cost of housing, but we have control over it? Leave that on the table. We need to take care of that. The labor component, certainly with aging workforce, do we have all the folks that we need in the construction and trade industries to build the new houses that we need? If we don't, what are some creative solutions there? Are there temporary workers that we could bring in from elsewhere to help during a summer construction season to get us unstuck and to bring mobility back to the market? So being able to break it into the component parts makes this overwhelming challenge feel a little bit more manageable because it gives us some tangible things that we can work on now. And maybe the federal environment shifts a bit. Maybe it shifts in our favor, maybe it doesn't. But again, we don't have control over that, so we have to set it aside.
So, of the pieces that we do have control over, and let's just talk with permitting, you must be informing and presenting this data to legislators who, in my opinion, have the biggest sway over our laws. Is that factual?
I am trying my best to get this
Well,
information to as many people as I can.
when I say factual, what I mean is because a lot of times we're having this
Mm-hmm.
conversation and we say Vermont is in the way, but then you have to boil it down to what is the Vermont that's
Mm-hmm.
making these decisions. And
Yes, yes.
our legislative bodies are the ones who control regulation on a state level, not a local level,
Mm,
because that exists locally.
that's right.
But on a state level, Act 250, Act 181, adjustments to that, amendments, that's held at the legislative level. If it's clearly identified that we're standing in the way of development, what's the reaction that you're hearing, and why hasn't that changed quicker?
Yeah.
I know that's a big question, but it's if we're going to change anything, that's where it would have to be.
You're asking a great question. I just want to be transparent in saying I'm not a lobbyist. The Futures Project is a 501c3, so my role is education. And yes, I
Education.
have been getting this data, this information to policymakers. I think that follow-up conversation between you and my colleagues at the Vermont Chamber of Commerce who work on the policy side and
Okay.
do the advocating would be a great future episode.
All right.
But with that, I have in my conversations with legislators through an education lens helped them to understand the challenges and the scale of action that's needed. Back to the specificity. If we're only permitting 2,500 homes per year, but
Mm-hmm.
the rate that we need is 7,500, then clearly what we're doing is not working. And the Economic Action Plan does make recommendations for how do we get more efficient? How do we speed things up? How do we lower costs? And a few examples of recommendations that have actually moved forward: project-based TIF, which is now called CHIP, Community Housing Improvement Program.
Yes.
That was a recommendation.
So that broke through.
Yes, yeah. So that's an example of an idea that was in the plan, informed by data that has now been implemented. But that was just one, and there's so many more that we should act on, and that we need to act on. For example, there was a recommendation about having a permit review shot clock. And this is informed by folks who have gone through development projects where they submit a proposal and then that proposal just sits on a desk, sometimes for over a year, because there's no deadline for when the review has to happen by. So why don't we implement review timeline such that if we run up against the end of that shot clock, that timeline, then we move it through as approved. In the absence of that, projects can get held up just because someone forgot about a piece of paper on their desk, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So process improvements can certainly be part of it. But for me, it comes back to, do we want to grow or not? Because right now, the default answer when proposals get put forth for new housing, regardless of what type of housing, the default answer is no.
We have to examine that for a second because that, to me, that's so indicative. So, one, your role, and I'll save my policy pushing questions for your counterparts at the chamber. But do you believe that the decision makers at least understand the data that you're presenting increasingly? So
Yeah.
that's a good sign.
Yeah. We're starting to see not only legislators or even local decision makers start to connect the dots. We're starting to see the general public connect the dots a bit more too. And
You
I
know,
have data to back that up.
and it's needed because, and I felt this way for a while, which is I step back and I look, and especially I have young kids, and I say to myself, what is the future for them if they want to stay in this state in 10, 15 years? challenges are they going to have to potentially buy a home here in that period of time? And with the trend going the way it is, I'm actually concerned that Vermont as a state will just literally go bankrupt. And somehow, I don't know how we pull out of that, but I do have that concern. So if they're understanding that this is serious now and we need to grow, and there's all these little things that we can do, let's speak to the default though, because
Mm-hmm.
we got here because there's a contingent who clearly doesn't want to grow. So, what have you gotten for feedback through talking to not just decision makers, not just policymakers, but just Vermonters around the state? Why would we not want to grow? And here's the funny thing, and I was reading some of your stuff last night. One of the questions you had was it starts in three tiers, which is does Vermont need more homes? And I think it was like 60% of Vermonters said yes. And would you be okay with building homes in your like town or county? And then it drops to 55% or something like that. And I know you know the exact numbers. And then it says, would you be okay with somebody building in your neighborhood? And then it drops to an even lesser percentage. And when I read through who was voting no and yes, I was quite surprised that younger people are saying no more so than older people. So, how do we package all that to understand why is the default no?
I think the default is no because of what I mentioned earlier with the cultural sentiment towards growth as a potential threat, right? So I hear the words protect or conserve or preserve in a lot of these conversations, especially when it's anti growth, anti development. It is necessary for us to pause and just ask protection from what and for whom, right? Because if that level of protection, the safeguarding, hitting the brakes on development leads to decline, are we actually causing more harm than good? There's also imbalance of privilege and power and who gets to say no, how our policies and processes empower the no perspective more than the yes perspective. And I'll give you an example again to bring it to life. I was speaking with someone on the development review board in Williston. Williston has a lot of retail stores. Lots of the workers in those stores don't live in Williston. They have to drive to get to work, sometimes a pretty long distance. Some of them might want to live closer to where they work. They've voiced that. Williston has tried to add more housing and they've had some successes, but each time there's a new proposal, again, the default is no, and a coalition of people who don't want to see it happen show up and slow down the process and sometimes kill those proposals. All of those retail workers who want to live closer, who are not Williston residents, who want to say yes, have no say in the process. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That's just the current reality of how the process is constructed. So to link that back to the data you referenced, that's from the Vermonter poll. We did ask this question: are you supportive of creating new housing to increase the population in Vermont? What about in your town? What about in your neighborhood? And we've seen a shift towards more and more people saying yes over the years. We've asked the same question multiple years in a row so we can compare the data. And the most recent data, over 70% said yes in Vermont, right? So there's this recognition that, yeah, we need some growth. At the town level, it's a little closer to 60%, so still a strong majority. Even at the neighborhood level, the most recent data, over 50% of people said yes. Now, do all those people have the time, the ability, or even the bravery to show up and say yes? Or are we drowning out that sentiment with processes that over empower the no perspective?
After you're getting these responses, these answers, and you're pulling the data, and we keep getting into housing as the issue, do you sometimes run into the job creation piece?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that is like the other direct side of it, which is I don't think prices are going to drastically go down unless we have a complete excess of supply. So with that, how do we incentivize some of the businesses to stay here and to grow that workforce so that people can also afford the houses that are available?
Yeah, yeah, great question. And I'll link it to part two of the question you asked prior, which was the differential answers between young people and older respondents. And you and I were both surprised that it was the young people saying no. Jobs was a part of it. So younger people were saying no at higher rates because they saw growth as competition in a scarce housing market. Competition in a scarce housing market. They are okay with people not moving here so that there's more left for them.
Ah,
Whereas older respondents were saying yes because they're thinking about the practicality of aging in their communities and access to services, essential services like healthcare, right? Where are the workers? Where are the nurses? We don't have enough of them. We need a bit of growth. They're also thinking about the tax implications. I think when you get to that point in your life, there's a bit of wisdom that comes with age of how these public services and programs operate and the tax base that's needed to sustain them. But to then link that to jobs, this is a concern that I heard time and again. And there are some interesting trends because one of the stories, the narratives that I heard growing up here in Vermont was as a young person, you might need to leave, start your career elsewhere. Maybe you come back. There aren't enough good jobs for
heard
young
that too.
people. And we can spend another episode unpacking what a good job means, right? But for the purpose of this conversation, the data from over a decade ago showed that there were certainly fewer job opportunities available compared to now. But I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that there's been an acceleration of retirements to the point that right now in the state of Vermont, there are 2 open jobs for every 1 job seeker. Growth, right, would help to sustain the businesses we already have that are desperately crying out and saying, we need more employees. But even if everyone in Vermont who's actively looking for a job found a Vermont based job, we'd still have about 10,000 open jobs remaining.
So you had something interesting in the data too that was there's I think it was like 70,000 Vermonters of like that working age who are not working and receiving some sort of benefit that allows them not to work, and that if a higher proportion of them enter the workforce, that would fill some of those. Is that sort of that benefit system that you were talking about?
That section of the Economic Action Plan talked about benefits cliffs, right? And these emerge from policy choices that, again, in isolation, each of them may have been well intended, but when we put them together, the overall design creates these barriers that may disincentivize labor force participation. It may disincentivize career growth because if you incrementally increase your wages above a certain threshold, the benefits that you might lose outweigh the economic gain of that wage increase. So if we just approach it from a core principles perspective, no one should ever be penalized for wanting to grow in their career, to take a promotion, to earn a raise. And sometimes we see rational decisions to not pursue that growth because of the policy structure that would penalize them. With that said, though, labor force participation rates among working age adults, so ages 25 to 54, is defined as prime working age by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Those rates are quite high for working age adults, labor force
But which,
participation.
you mean the rates of the labor force participation?
Yeah, yeah. So working age people are working. The rates are in the mid to upper 80% range. You had mentioned earlier that the overall labor force participation rate was in the low 60s. That's driven mostly by retirements. So people are exiting the labor force. And we, because of our unbalanced demographics, because our median age is so high, that decrease in the overall rate has been demographically driven. It's not because prime working age adults aren't working. Most of them are, and some of them are working multiple jobs and just trying to make ends meet.
Yeah, I'm looking here. I had that age demographic is quite significant because I think it's 135, 140,000 of our population is currently over 60 or is it 65?
65.
65. And so they're not in the labor force, a lot of them. And that population shift is just continuing to grow. So let's back up for a second. What happens if the current trajectory continues? So we have another year, 2026. So let's fast forward to January 2027. We've lost another 2 to 3,000 people. That keeps happening for 2 to 3 years. So we end up going the complete opposite direction. Where is that going to leave the state?
Through what perspective? We can tackle this in a healthcare perspective, a labor force perspective, and a taxing perspective.
So I say it in a sense knowing that doesn't seem to be sustainable for anybody, because now you have an even smaller percentage of individuals who are taxed. They'll have to be taxed at a higher rate, even if we've cut our expenditures and we've cut. Just having, it's almost like you can't cut fast enough if the people you're actually taxing keep shrinking.
Correct. Yep.
And so it just seems completely unsustainable. Where's the point where like we almost can't recover?
Yeah. I wish I had a specific answer for you. And I mentioned the phrase earlier, economic hospice. What you just described was what came to mind when I said that phrase, which is that there will eventually be a breaking point, and just trying to cut expenses is trying to minimize the pain in the short term. If we continue on that trajectory, healthcare costs are likely to continue increasing because as a population ages, generally people need more and more care. That cost shift that happens in how healthcare is funded means the commercial ratepayers have to pay higher and higher prices. And that commercial pool of payers is shrinking. So that's a losing formula. Same thing with taxes. So I get into this with the Economic Action Plan through a metric called dependency ratio. When there is a higher proportion of dependents, which are people over 65 or under 16, generally those populations consume more services than they're sort of contributing to the economy. When dependency ratio grows, it's signaling that a larger and larger portion of the economic burden is being placed on a smaller and smaller ratio of the population. So if we continue on that trajectory and Vermont's population decreases and working age adults are finding it unsustainable to live in Vermont and they move elsewhere, that means the people who are left have to pay even more.
Which is what we're seeing where we are.
Yep. And I don't know what that breaking point is, because some of that's determined at an individual level or a family level. It's why affordability as a buzzword can sometimes be confusing, because affordability is also relative. What's affordable to one family isn't affordable to another. And I've talked to some Vermonters that say they love Vermont and they can make ends meet and they're fine paying a premium because they believe that everything we're doing is what we should be doing. I've also talked to some Vermonters that say it's just unsustainable, it's too costly, I can't afford what's happening. I actually think that, and this is a direct quote from someone that I spoke with, they said, I think people need to be self-reliant. We're doing too much in terms of public services and programs. My taxes are too high. I don't know if I can stay in Vermont.
It's a very common conversation these days.
Yeah. The majority of people I speak to, though, because I just shared a couple of perspectives there. One is I can afford it. Another is I can't and we need to cut. Most people I talk to say the affordability challenge is real and I think we should solve it by growing.
If I shift the conversation for a second, because I had to get doom and gloom, because it's on my mind, and if it's on my mind and it's on other people's mind, which is really how long can we be in this like death spiral? On the other side of that is anybody who's visited Vermont, lived in Vermont, there is something just beautiful about this state. It's green, we have the mountains. I think most people I've met in this state are good, hardworking. There's a character of Vermont that I think is very unique and special. And there's very few people, especially when I'm traveling, who've been to Vermont who don't say they had a wonderful time and they enjoyed it. And they've even considered being there or have some sort of roots there. So Vermont does have a lot of things going for it. Of all the stats, we still remain one of the safest places in the entire country. So it actually is a great place to raise a family and to be. What are other states who've been successful at attracting people doing that we could take a page from in terms of we know housing is one. So if we know if we built more houses, that would fix a lot of it. But what would be some other sort of branding things that we could do as a state that would be like, we're open for business, come here? Because we did have years of better growth,
Mm-hmm.
people coming here, and that's when we saw that population rise. So and you had that in one of your pages because you had a number of different initiatives that could be done. What are some of the ones that you would like to see done the most in terms of attracting people here, assuming we had the housing to support it?
Yeah, because it has to go in
It
tandem.
has to go. There has to
Yep.
be the housing for them to come.
So a couple that come to mind for me, and we'll start with the branding piece, or what's the message? One of the phrases that you've probably heard me say is Vermont needs more people need Vermont. What does that mean? People might need Vermont for a variety of reasons. Some people might need Vermont as a place to recreate. We get a lot of tourists that come here for skiing, for hiking, for the great outdoors, and then they start to build a love and affinity for the place. And maybe that's the starting point for thinking about relocating to Vermont and enjoying those recreational opportunities every single day instead of just a few weekends a year. More people need Vermont perhaps for climate reasons. I've been speaking with a rural geographer at UVM who's been tracking why people move to Vermont, knowing that it's always multifaceted, right? Why someone moves is often not just because of one thing, but more and more people have said climate is one factor that they're considering when choosing Vermont. More people might need Vermont because of the small town feel and the community oriented social life that emerges in many of our small towns. And during the pandemic, more people needed Vermont because it was a relatively safe place with low rates of COVID, where the lack of population density worked to our advantage.
Yeah.
Remote work certainly enabled some of that to happen. That can be part of a longer term strategy as well. Vermont was one of the first places, I think it was the first place to offer a relocation incentive. It made national news, international news. I still remember some of the headlines. Vermont is paying people $10,000 to move there, right? So we had first to market advantage, but other places have started to adopt that strategy and outcompete Vermont, and we've since discontinued it. But perhaps there's an opportunity to revisit that because the analysis of that program showed that by year 2, there was positive ROI, meaning that the people who moved here and received a grant to help with relocation paid back that amount and more by the second year of living here,
I
and in
didn't know
terms of the
that.
taxes that they contributed. But that's where marketing and messaging and branding is so important, because what was missed in that initiative was communicating how it benefits Vermonters. I had friends that said, "Why are we paying people $10,000 to move here? I'm struggling now. Pay me $10,000 to stay."
Maybe we should. And it's interesting that, especially when you're inside and running a business, like marketing and branding yourself is so important. And as a state, we need that too.
Other ideas for growth, we mentioned business climate earlier, and this is where other states, again, are doing much better than we are, and we can learn from those examples in terms of what are the tax structures, what are the regulatory environments, what's the technical assistance available to help businesses scale up. We have a lot of small businesses that may be on the precipice of growth and are ready to become a medium-sized company, but if they're running the numbers and investing in growth here costs a lot more than investing in growth in another state, that again works as a disadvantage. And again, there are playbooks from elsewhere that we can essentially copy. The need for that business growth feeds back into a bright spot, which is we have a lot of college graduates. I mentioned
We
many
do.
of them leave Vermont. We can see in the data where they're going to. They're going to places like Boston, New York City, DC, Denver, some of the large cities in California, where they, as graduates, are more likely to find a job that fits with their skills and qualifications, and they can also get a better return on the investment they made in their education, higher wage premium for having a degree in those labor markets compared to Vermont. The way we create those types of opportunities here so they might stay is through business growth. If companies can scale up, the data also shows as firm size grows, wages also grow. So those two things work together. Those are the things that come to mind. We could sit down page by page and go through the
It,
recommendations.
I
But
would encourage anybody who hasn't read your action plan to read it because it's fascinating. And it does put to light so much of the how
mhm.
we got here. And I think it informs anybody who has to make a decision as to here are some actually concrete things. Because as much as I would like there to be a simple, quick solution, it seems like we got here bit by bit and we have to bit by bit untangle it.
That's why we wrote the plan. It's not only how we got here, but how we get out of here too.
Couple more things. So immigration does pay a factor.
Yep.
And I know we had programs and incentives that brought people here. That could be one avenue. You had the 800,000 mark. Do you think that we could even go above that?
It's possible. I think that having that number as a starting point was really based on that workforce gap analysis I mentioned. How many people are leaving the workforce versus how many people are coming in. That gap annually is about 13,500. We picked the 802 target because when we look out over the next decade, that's how many people we would need to fill that annual workforce gap. The numbers got in the 800,000 range, right? We picked 802, yes, because of the area code. It's
Can
memorable, it's
it
symbolic.
is
There's
802 for
pride in it.
802.
It's the same reason why, like my distance running friends, they don't say, I'm going to go run 25 miles. No, it's 26.2. The symbolic things really help to motivate us, and it gives a level of meaning and purpose to a number that can really be inspiring. So you asked, could we go above that? Certainly could. It would really require, back to what I was saying earlier, this embracing of a growth mindset of understanding, okay, what are the possible futures and the benefits that come with it if we get to an even higher number? Because that 800,000, as I mentioned, that's just to keep pace with the workforce gap that is emerging. If we don't get there, it might mean some tough decisions in terms of lower levels of overall employment, smaller tax base, and adapting to that reality. If we go above it, it opens up so many more possibilities. But we needed to have some specificity for where are we trying to get to and why.
It's a good plan, and I'm really pulling for more people to hear what you have to say and understand the data because we need it. And for all the sort of desperado we talked about in the beginning, Vermont's still a great place to be. And the more you travel outside and you get lost in the noise, and I call it the urban sprawl that exists so many other places, it's nice here and
Mm.
it's beautiful. And so I feel like yourself and others are just fighting to get the message out that there are ways out of this if we just keep chipping away at the right initiatives and the right programs. So
Growth isn't a threat to all those wonderful things that you just described, too. In some ways, it's necessary to sustain exactly what you talked about. So To alleviate some of the fears, I'll share a few more numbers as we wrap up. Vermont currently, our population, 644,000, means we have about 70 people per square mile. One of the comments that I hear a lot when talking about the Economic Action Plan and growing to 802, one of the comments in opposition is, I don't want Vermont to turn into New Jersey. That level of growth, that would destroy Vermont. So I ran the numbers. New Jersey is about 1,300 people per square mile compared to 70 in Vermont.
Okay.
That's a huge range. If we grow to 802, we go from 70 to 87. So
I think that's more digestible.
17 more people per square mile. 1 square mile is 640 acres. I think we can figure out how to fit 17 more people in a 640 acre parcel. And we could do that even with existing land use regulations.
So now what you have to do is you have to throw that exact piece into AI and just make a visual
Yeah,
and just start to use that.
to make it a little bit less scary. Vermont's population would have to get to 11.5 million before we reach New Jersey level density. So we're not going to become a state of sprawl. And just rural revitalization actually gets us halfway to 802. We need that growth to sustain what we already have.
Okay. So Kevin, as we wrap up here, last couple questions. What is the next data point that you're looking at next as like a clue or indicator? And then what's next for you as you keep getting out there and giving the message out?
Yeah, great question. Certainly the population change dynamics I'm examining closely, not only in aggregate. You mentioned Vermont lost 1,800 people over the past year. That can be broken down by births versus deaths, in and out migration domestically, and also international migration. Nationwide, we've seen a drop in international migration that's impacting Vermont as well. But I'm also examining where are people moving to in other states, right? Because that helps us orient ourselves to what are the strategies that are working elsewhere. That gives us clues as to where we can find possible solutions. In addition to that, I'm examining what is the dynamic at a more regional or local level. And I think that's so important in these data conversations is to go beyond just speaking about Vermont in aggregate, but what's it like in a particular community, in a particular county. The population change dynamics are very different in Chittenden County than they are in the Northeast Kingdom and different than they are in Southern Vermont. And that's okay, right? That's a starting point for understanding what's happening. And then we have to ask, what do we do about it? And that answer is going to be different in each of those locations as well. So that's one thing that I'm tracking. And then what comes next? The next piece is going to be a bit of a grassroots activation of information sharing. So I mentioned I had the privilege of traveling around the state and engaging with so many Vermonters who were willing to share their challenges and also where they want to see the state go. And many of those people have stayed in touch. They've raised their hand and said,
Right.
How can I help? And now that we've launched the plan and we've launched the competitiveness dashboard, and I've worked tirelessly to get the word out, there's this recognition that I actually can't do it alone. And that's okay. And I need help doing that. So we have a growing network of ambassadors, again, who have said, I want to help. We'll be taking some of our data visualizations, our content, and distributing it to these local champions, ambassadors in their communities to help inspire data-informed conversations to make sure that discussions about development or growth or policy actually examines the data. And I'm so excited to see where Vermonters take that in their sphere of influence to start changing the trajectory of our state.
So that's a big bright spot. Well, Kevin, I really appreciate you coming in today. I hope this isn't the last time that I see you here. And just keep doing what you're doing and giving that education to everyone. And I'm hopeful. I really am.
too.
I think that once you talk about it, once you talk about growth and what it means and how it isn't as scary, I think more and more people will start to buy in, and especially this year. So
Yeah. I'll end by saying that we can examine those words in a personal context, personal growth, professional development. And every time I say those phrases, people celebrate it, they
That's
encourage
right.
me. Let's extend that same sentiment to a community level, community growth, economic development.
Let's do it. I'll keep up the fight too. So thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who listened in, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.